This enigmatic 1901 photograph concealed a secret that experts had sought to decipher for decades. Dr. Elena Vasquez had devoted 20 years to restoring historical photographs, but this one was unlike anything she had encountered. It was a warm, humid August morning in 2024, and she was seated in her Cambridge, Massachusetts studio, examining an image brought to her by the Boston Historical Society. The 1901 picture depicted the affluent Thornton family of Beacon Hill posing within their elaborate garden. The photograph itself was an exquisite example of early 20th century portraiture. The Thornton family was arranged on their meticulously kept lawn, the father, Richard Thornton, at the center, his wife Catherine beside him, their 3 daughters in white lace dresses, and a young boy, perhaps 5 years old, standing between the parents. Their impressive brownstone residence stood behind them, framed by carefully manicured hedges. Elena's task was the digital restoration of the photograph, which had suffered from water damage and fading over many years. She began by scanning the image at a remarkably high resolution, then started the laborious process of removing blemishes, adjusting the contrast, and sharpening details that time had blurred. It was during this work on the background elements that she observed something unusual. Deep within the shadows beneath a massive oak tree at the frame's edge, there appeared to be a shape, a person that initial viewers would likely have missed or mistaken for a mere shadow or a garden ornament. Elena magnified the area and applied advanced digital enhancement techniques, subtly brightening the dark space while carefully maintaining detail. Her breathing hitched as the figure came into sharp relief. It was a woman, a black woman, dressed in the modest attire of a domestic servant. She was partially obscured by the tree trunk, yet her posture and placement suggested deliberate intention, not accident. Most strikingly, she was holding an infant wrapped in white fabric. The woman's face, now clearly visible due to the enhancement, displayed an expression Elena found difficult to interpret. Sadness mingled with something else, perhaps pride or defiance. Elena leaned back from her computer screen, her thoughts racing. The presence of a black domestic worker in a wealthy white family's photograph would not typically cause surprise. Many such images from that era included servants, usually positioned marginally or in the background to signify the family's affluence. However, the specific placement of this woman seemed both intentional and concealed, and the manner in which she held the infant suggested a significance beyond a simple inclusion of household staff. Elena zoomed in on the baby in the woman's arms. Although the infant's features were hard to distinguish, the child appeared to be quite light-skinned. She then examined the young boy standing with the Thornton family. He looked to be about 5 years old, with light brown hair and features resembling the family patriarch. A hypothesis began to take shape in Elena's mind, one that caused her pulse to quicken. She retrieved the original work order from the Historical Society. The photograph had been donated by the Thornton family's descendants as part of a larger collection documenting prominent Boston families. The accompanying records identified the individuals in the main group: Richard Thornton, his wife Catherine, their daughters Margaret, Elizabeth, and Anne, and their nephew James, whose parents had supposedly perished in a cholera epidemic, leaving him an orphan. But there was no mention of the woman in the shadows, nor the infant she held. Elena spent the remainder of the day researching the Thornton family. Richard Thornton had been a highly successful textile merchant and one of Boston's wealthiest individuals in the early 1900s. His family held a prominent position in Boston society, attending prestigious churches, hosting elaborate functions, and serving on charitable boards. Catherine originated from old Boston money, with a lineage tracing back to the colonial period. As was customary for households of their social standing, the family employed numerous domestic servants. Elena located census records listing several black servants working in the Thornton household in 1900 and 1910. However, identifying the specific woman in the photograph would require further investigation. As evening arrived, Elena printed a high-resolution copy of the digitally enhanced photograph and fastened it to her wall. She found herself unable to stop looking at the woman in the shadows, the baby she cradled, and the expression on her face, which to Elena seemed to be that of someone attempting to assert a claim over something that had been taken, even if only through the medium of a photograph. Something significant had transpired within this family, a truth deliberately obscured in plain sight for more than a century, and Elena was determined to uncover the reality. The following morning, Elena contacted the Boston Historical Society, speaking with Dr. Patricia Chen, the curator who had sent her the photograph. "I've examined hundreds of photographs from this period," Elena explained as Patricia Chen listened intently to her description of the discovery in the enhanced image. "And the positioning of this woman feels purposeful. She's not just casually in the background. She's been strategically placed where she would be visible, but easily overlooked, particularly in a print of lower quality than the original." Patricia was intrigued. The Thornton family had only donated this collection 6 months prior. The current family members asserted they were merely clearing out an old estate and thought the Historical Society might be interested in the contents. They had not expressed any particular interest in the materials themselves. "Do you believe there's a story here worth investigating?" Patricia asked. "I am certain of it," Eleanor responded, "but I will need access to more records, employment documents, birth certificates, anything that might help identify the woman in the photograph and the infant she is holding." Patricia agreed to assist. Together, they began sifting through the Thornton family papers that had been donated along with the photographs. The collection included business ledgers, social correspondence, property records, and household account books spanning from 1890 to 1920. In a household account book dated 1901, they found regular payments to several domestic servants, including a note, "Clara Washington, cook and housemaid, $8 per month plus room." This entry began in 1899 and continued until 1902, where it abruptly ceased with a single word written in the margin, "Dismissed." Elena felt a jolt of recognition. Clara Washington. She photographed the page, carefully noting the dates. If Clara had been dismissed in 1902, and if she was the woman in the 1901 photograph, something significant must have transpired in that household. Their search continued, yielding an even more revealing item in a collection of personal letters. A letter from Catherine Thornton to her sister in Philadelphia, dated March 1901, contained a section that made Elena's hands tremble. "We have taken in Richard's nephew James, as you know, following the tragic loss of his parents," the letter read. "The boy is adjusting well to our household, though the circumstances of his arrival have been complicated by unfortunate rumors," it continued. "I assure you these rumors are entirely without foundation. James is our blood relation, and we are providing him the upbringing his station deserves." The letter concluded, "We have had to make certain household adjustments to ensure propriety is maintained." The letter was subtly phrased, but Eleanor could interpret the underlying meaning. Rumors, household adjustments, the defensive affirmation that James was a blood relative. This was a family grappling with a scandal. Patricia then made another crucial discovery in the birth records at Boston City Hall. There was indeed a record for a James Thornton, born in February 1896, listed as the son of Richard Thornton's deceased brother. However, when Patricia requested the death certificates for James's supposed parents, she found something perplexing. They had died in 1898, not 1896. If James had been born in 1896, he would have been 2 years old when his parents died, not a newborn orphan as the family narrative claimed. "This doesn't make sense," Patricia remarked, spreading the documents across the table. "The timeline is incorrect. And look at this. James's birth certificate lists his place of birth as Boston, but his parents supposedly lived in New York at the time. Why would the mother have traveled to Boston to give birth? Eleanor examined the birth certificate more closely. Something about it looked unusual. The handwriting seemed slightly different from other certificates from that period, and there was a notation in the margin that had been partially obscured. Amended record. This birth certificate was altered, Elena said quietly. Someone changed the original information. They sat in silence, absorbing the implications. A child born in 1896, raised as the Thornton family's nephew, an altered birth certificate, dismissed household servants, and a photograph showing a black woman holding an infant while hidden in the shadows of the family garden. The pieces were beginning to form a narrative, though it was not yet complete. Elena needed to find out more about Clara Washington, the woman who had worked for the Thornton household and was abruptly dismissed. She needed to track James Thornton's life after 1901 and understand why the family had gone to such elaborate lengths to conceal the truth. Elena spent the following week diligently searching for every record related to Clara Washington. The search was difficult. Washington was a common last name among black Bostonians, and Clara had left few traces in official documents. But Elena persisted, and a picture gradually began to emerge. Clara Washington was born in Virginia in 1875, the daughter of formerly enslaved people who had migrated north after the Civil War. She arrived in Boston in 1897, seeking employment as a domestic servant. By 1899, she was working for the Thornton family as both cook and housemaid in their Beacon Hill mansion. Elena found Clara listed in the 1900 census, residing at the Thornton address. The census described her as single, Negro, age 25, and employed as a domestic servant. However, there was a handwritten note in the margin of the census form that Elena almost missed. Infant daughter, not enumerated. This note was unusual and suggested the census taker was unsure how to categorize a child in the household. The key breakthrough came when Elena discovered birth records at Boston Lying-In Hospital, an institution that had provided maternity care to both wealthy and poor women in the early 1900s. Among the records from February 1896 was an entry for Clara Washington Negro, age 21, delivered of a male infant. The father's name was listed as unknown, but there was more. Attached to the hospital record was a note from the attending physician. Patient employed by R. Thornton family. Infant to remain with mother and Thornton household per family arrangement. Fee paid by R. Thornton. Elena's theory was solidifying. Clara had given birth to a son in February 1896 while working for the Thornton family. Richard Thornton had covered the hospital expenses, and somehow this infant had been transformed into James Thornton, the orphaned nephew. She needed to find out what had happened to Clara after her dismissal in 1902. Using city directories and church records, Elena traced Clara's movements after she left the Thornton household. She found Clara listed as residing in a boarding house in Boston's South End in 1903, working as a laundress. But the trail ran cold after that year. No census entries, no employment records, no death certificate. Then Patricia made a discovery that changed everything. In the archives of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston, she located a baptismal record from 1896 for James Washington, son of Clara Washington. The baptism had occurred just weeks after the hospital birth record, and it clearly identified the child's surname as Washington, not Thornton. The church records also contained a letter from Clara to the church pastor dated 1902. Patricia photographed the letter and sent it to Elena immediately. Elena read Clara's words with increasing emotional intensity. "Reverend Williams, I write to you in desperation, not knowing where else to turn," it began. "You baptized my son James 6 years ago, and I have raised him with love despite the difficult circumstances of his birth." She continued, His father, a man of prominent standing, whom I will not name, provided support for us while demanding absolute secrecy about his paternity. Now that man's wife has determined that my presence in their household is no longer acceptable, the letter stated. She has insisted I be dismissed, and worse, she has told me that James will remain with them, to be raised as their own kin. She says I am unfit to mother him, that he deserves better than a life with a colored laundress, Clara wrote. She has offered me money to go quietly, to never speak of James's true parentage, to never attempt to see him again. Reverend, he is my son. I carried him, birthed him, nursed him, raised him for 6 years, but I have no legal standing, the letter pleaded. I am a Negro woman with no family, no resources, no power. The Thorntons have everything: wealth, position, legal counsel. If I fight them, they will destroy me and possibly harm James in the process, she lamented. If I accept their terms, I lose my child, but perhaps secure him a life of opportunity I could never provide. I do not know what to do. I pray for guidance, for strength, for some way to do right by my son, even as my heart breaks. Elena wiped tears from her eyes. The letter was dated October 1902, approximately the time Clara had been dismissed from the Thornton household. Clara had been faced with an impossible choice: fight for her son and likely lose while damaging his future prospects, or step away and allow him to be raised in privilege and comfort, never knowing his true mother. The 1901 photograph acquired a new layer of meaning. That image had been captured only a year before Clara was forced out. It showed Clara standing in the shadows holding an infant. But which infant was it? Could there have been another child? Or was the photograph misdated? Eleanor needed to examine the photograph again with greater scrutiny, and she needed to discover what became of James Thornton as he matured. Did he ever learn the truth about Clara? Did he ever question his origins? And most importantly, had Clara ever attempted to see her son again? Or had she vanished from his life permanently? Elena returned to her studio and pulled up the enhanced photograph on her computer screen. She had been so concentrated on identifying the woman in the shadows that she hadn't meticulously examined every single detail of the image. Now, she looked more closely at the infant Clara was holding. Using maximum magnification, Eleanor studied the baby's features and the white christening gown it wore. Then she compared this infant to the young boy standing with the Thornton family, the child identified as 5-year-old James. Her breath caught. The infant in Clara's arms could not be 5 years old. The baby was clearly only a few months old at the very most. But if James was born in 1896, he would have been 5 in 1901, matching the age of the boy in the main photograph. A shiver ran down Elena's spine. There were 2 children in this photograph: James, the 5-year-old boy standing with the Thornton family as their nephew, and a much younger infant in Clara's arms. She immediately called Patricia. "There's another child," she said urgently. "Clara is holding an infant who is not James. I need to find birth records from 1900 or 1901 for any child connected to the Thornton household." Patricia grasped the implication immediately. They met again at the Historical Society and began a systematic search through birth records from 1900 and 1901. This time, they knew which patterns to look for: any birth involving the Thornton family, any notation concerning domestic servants, any amended or unusual records. It took 2 days, but they found it. In March 1901, just months before the photograph was taken, Boston Lying In Hospital recorded the birth of a female infant to Clara Washington, Negro domestic servant. Once more, Richard Thornton had paid the hospital fees. The father was listed as unknown, but the notation was identical to the one from James's birth 5 years earlier. Clara had given birth to a second child in 1901, another child fathered by Richard Thornton. The infant in the photograph was Clara's daughter. Where is this child? Eleanor wondered aloud. What happened to her? Patricia began searching adoption records, death certificates, anything that might trace the fate of Clara's daughter. The search proved difficult. The timeline fit perfectly. The photograph had been taken in the summer of 1901, showing Clara holding her infant daughter. By September, just months later, Clara had been compelled to surrender the child to an orphanage. But there was more. Attached to the intake record was a note. Adoption finalized October 1901. Child placed with family in New York. Record sealed per family request. Substantial donation received from anonymous benefactor to support orphanage operations. Elena understood. The Thorntons had arranged for Clara's daughter to be adopted away. They had paid for the adoption to be expedited and the record sealed. They had removed the second child from Clara's life, just as they had taken James. But they had allowed Clara one thing, that photograph. They had permitted her to stand in the shadows of their garden, holding her infant daughter one last time, creating a permanent record of her motherhood, even as they prepared to take that child away from her. The photograph wasn't just a family portrait, Eleanor said quietly. It was Clara's last chance to be seen as a mother, even if only in the margins, even if only in the shadows. Someone in that family, maybe Richard himself, maybe even Catherine, understood that Clara deserved at least that much. Patricia nodded slowly. But why keep the photograph? Why not destroy it if it contained evidence of their secrets? Because someone wanted the truth preserved, Elena replied. Even if it was hidden, even if it took more than a century to be discovered, someone wanted Clara's motherhood documented. Eleanor shifted her focus to James Thornton, the son Clara had lost when he was 6 years old. What had become of him? Had he lived his entire life believing he was Richard Thornton's nephew, never knowing his mother had been dismissed from the household when he was a child? She began by tracing James through census records over the decades. In 1910, at age 14, he appeared in the Thornton household, listed as a nephew attending preparatory school. By 1920, at age 24, he had graduated from Harvard Law School and was working at a Boston law firm. The 1930 census showed James Thornton, aged 34, married to a woman named Elizabeth, living in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood with 2 young children. His occupation was listed as attorney. He had clearly achieved success and respectability, but there was something else in the 1930 census that caught Elena's attention. Under race, James was listed as white, but there was a minuscule notation in the margin, barely visible, that read, "Mulatto amended." Someone had originally recorded James as mixed race, then changed it to white. Elena's heart raced. Had there been questions about James's racial identity? Had someone noticed that he didn't look entirely white, or had rumors about his true parentage followed him into adulthood? She searched newspaper archives looking for any mention of James Thornton. What she found astonished her. In 1935, James had made headlines by taking on a controversial case, defending a black family who had been forcibly evicted from their home in a white Boston neighborhood. The case garnered significant attention because James, a white attorney from a prominent Boston family, worked without payment to defend the black family against wealthy white property owners. He won the case, establishing a precedent that weakened discriminatory housing practices. Over the subsequent decades, Eleanor discovered that James Thornton had become one of Boston's most prominent civil rights attorneys. He defended countless black clients, fought against segregation in schools and public accommodations, and was instrumental in several landmark cases that advanced racial justice in Massachusetts. In 1954, the year of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, James gave a speech at the NAACP's Boston chapter that was covered by local newspapers. Eleanor found the text of his speech in the archives. "I stand before you today as someone who has benefited from privilege all my life," he began. "The privilege of education, of social position, of being treated with respect simply because of the color of my skin. But I also stand before you as someone who knows that justice delayed is justice denied," he continued. "That separate is inherently unequal, and that we cannot rest until every person in this nation enjoys the full rights and dignity that our Constitution promises." The speech was powerful, but a brief passage near the end especially struck Elena. "There are people in our lives, people who love us, who sacrifice for us, whose contributions go unrecognized and unacknowledged," he said. "We owe them a debt we can never fully repay. The least we can do is fight for a world where such sacrifices are no longer necessary, where love and family are not constrained by the artificial boundaries of race." Elena wondered if James had known. Had he somehow learned about Clara? Had he dedicated his life to civil rights because he understood on some level that his own existence was the result of racial injustice? She needed to find out more. She needed to locate James's descendants, if any existed, and learn whether the family had preserved any personal papers or documents that might reveal what James knew about his origins. Elena located James Thornton's grandson through public records. Michael Thornton, age 68, was a retired professor of African American history living in Cambridge, only a few miles from Elena's studio. When she called to explain her research, there was a prolonged silence on the other end of the line. "I think you should come to my house," Michael finally said. "There are things I need to show you." 2 days later, Elena sat in Michael's living room, surrounded by boxes of documents and photographs he had inherited from his grandfather. Michael was a tall man with dark eyes and skin that could be interpreted as either white or light-skinned black, depending on the observer. "My grandfather died in 1975, Michael began, "and he left me a sealed letter with instructions not to open it until after my father had passed away. My father died 5 years ago, and I finally opened the letter," he continued. "What I read completely changed my understanding of my family history." He handed Elena a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter in James Thornton's handwriting dated 1974, written when he was 78 years old. "My dear Michael," it started, "by the time you read this, I will be gone, and so will your father, who never knew the full truth of our family's origins. I write to you because you are a historian, because you have dedicated your life to uncovering difficult truths," the letter explained, "and because I believe you will understand why I kept this secret for so long. I am not who the world believes me to be. I am not the orphaned nephew of Richard and Catherine Thornton. I am the son of Richard Thornton and a black woman named Clara Washington, who worked in our household. Clara was my mother, though I was raised to call her by her first name and treat her as a servant until she was dismissed when I was 6 years old. I did not learn this truth until I was 30 years old," James wrote. "In 1932, a woman approached me outside my law office. She was elderly, frail, and I did not recognize her. She told me her name was Clara Washington and that she was my mother. She showed me documents, my original baptismal record, a letter she had written to her pastor, and a photograph of herself holding me as an infant in the garden of the Thornton house. At first, I did not believe her. The claim seemed impossible. But she provided details about my childhood that only someone intimately connected to me could have known, the names of my favorite toys, a song she used to sing to me, a birthmark on my shoulder that no one else would have seen. I spent weeks investigating her claims, examining birth records, speaking with old servants who had worked in the Thornton household," James confessed. "Everything she told me proved to be true. I was the son of a black woman, raised as white, given every privilege while my mother was forced to disappear from my life." My first reaction was anger at Richard Thornton, at Catherine, at everyone who had participated in this deception. But Clara asked me not to be angry. he recounted. She said she had made peace with what happened, that she had watched from a distance as I grew up, attended university, became a lawyer. She said she was proud of me and that she had never regretted carrying me, birthing me, loving me for the 6 years we had together. She also told me about my sister, a daughter she had birthed 5 years after me, also fathered by Richard Thornton. That child had been taken from her and adopted away. Clara had tried to find her for years but never succeeded. She showed me a photograph, the same one I now keep in my desk, showing her holding an infant in the Thornton garden. My sister, she said, was the baby in her arms. I spent the last years of Clara's life visiting her regularly, learning about her experiences, understanding the impossible choices she had faced. She died in 1935, and I was able to be with her at the end, holding her hand, calling her mother for the first time since I was 6 years old. After her death, I dedicated myself to fighting the kinds of injustices she had endured, James stated. I became a civil rights attorney because I understood personally how the color line destroyed families, how racial prejudice forced people into impossible situations, how systemic racism denied people their basic human dignity. Michael, you have chosen to study African American history. Now you know that you're part of that history, the letter concluded. Clara Washington was your great-grandmother. You carry her blood, her strength, her resilience. I have lived my life as a white man because that is how I was raised. But I want you to know the truth. I want you to honor Clara's memory, and I want you to find my sister if any trace of her remains. Your grandfather, James. Elena sat in stunned silence. Michael had tears running down his face. I've been searching for my great-aunt for 5 years, he said. I've traced adoption records, searched for children adopted from the Boston Home for Colored Children in 1901. Tried to find any connection, but the records are sealed or lost. I've hit dead ends everywhere. Elena thought about the photograph, about Clara standing in the shadows holding her infant daughter. That photograph is the key, she said. It's the only visual evidence of your great-aunt's existence. If we can get it properly publicized, if we can reach out to genealogists and historians, someone might recognize a family story or have records that connect. Michael nodded slowly. My grandfather spent 40 years fighting for civil rights, never publicly revealing his own connection to the black community, he reflected. He lived with that secret, honored Clara privately while presenting as white publicly. And now you've discovered the photograph that proves everything he wrote in this letter. There's something else, Elena said carefully. Your grandfather became one of Boston's most important civil rights attorneys. His work changed lives, changed laws, changed this city. That legacy came directly from Clara, from understanding what she endured, from knowing that his very existence was the result of exploitation and injustice that he spent his life fighting against. Clara's legacy, Michael said softly, not the Thorntons. Everything James accomplished came from her strength, her sacrifice, her love. Elena and Michael spent the next 3 months preparing to unveil the truth about the 1901 photograph. They gathered all the evidence, birth records, hospital documents, Clara's letters, James's confession, the photograph itself, and meticulously verified every detail. Michael contacted other family members. Some were shocked by the revelation, while others admitted they had always sensed there was something unusual about the family history. In November 2024, the Boston Historical Society held a press conference to announce the discovery. Elena presented the photograph, now fully restored and enhanced, clearly showing Clara Washington standing in the shadows, holding her infant daughter, while the Thornton family posed in the foreground with her son, James. The story captured national headlines. Major newspapers ran features about the photograph and the secret it had kept concealed for 123 years. Television news programs interviewed Elena and Michael. The image rapidly went viral on social media, sparking widespread discussions about hidden histories, racial injustice, and the complexity of American families. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the press conference, Michael received an email from a woman named Diane Roberts in Harlem, New York. She was 79 years old, and she believed she might be a descendant of Clara Washington's daughter. Michael called her immediately, and what Diane told him made his hands tremble. Her grandmother, who had died in 1980, had been adopted as an infant from a Boston orphanage in 1901. The grandmother had been told she was the daughter of a domestic servant who couldn't keep her, but no other details were provided. The grandmother had grown up in New York, married and had children, always wondering about her origins. "But there's something else," Diane said. "My grandmother kept a small photograph that had apparently been given to the adoptive family. It shows a black woman in a garden, and my grandmother always said she thought it might be her birth mother, though she could never prove it." Michael asked Diane to send him the photograph. When it arrived 2 days later, his heart nearly stopped. It was a second print of the same 1901 photograph Elena had restored, but this one had been cropped to show only Clara and the infant, with the Thornton family completely removed from the frame. Someone, perhaps Richard Thornton, perhaps someone else in the family, had provided Clara's daughter with a photograph of her mother holding her. It was an act of compassion, a way to ensure that even though the child would be raised by strangers, she would at least possess one image connecting her to the woman who had given birth to her. Elena arranged for Diane to travel to Boston. When she arrived, Michael met her at the airport, and they stared at each other in astonishment. They shared a great-grandmother. They were family, separated for over a century by adoption, by racial prejudice, by deliberate concealment, but family nonetheless. At the Historical Society, Elena showed Diane the full photograph, pointing out Clara in the shadows. Diane wept as she looked at her great-grandmother's face for the first time with certainty. "She was beautiful," Diane whispered. "She was proud. Look at how she's holding that baby, holding me. She loved me. Even knowing she would have to give me up, she loved me." Michael then showed Diane the letter his grandfather James had written, the confession revealing that he and Diane's grandmother had been siblings, both children of Clara Washington and Richard Thornton, separated and raised in different worlds. "My grandmother lived her whole life as a black woman," Diane said. "She married a black man, raised black children, lived through segregation and the civil rights movement. She never knew she had a brother who was passing as white, who was fighting for civil rights from the other side of the color line." "They were both Clara's children," Michael said softly, "both carrying her legacy, both shaped by the injustice that separated them from her. James fought in the courts. And your grandmother, what did she do?" Diane smiled through her tears. "She was a teacher in Harlem for 40 years, she said. She taught hundreds of black children, told them they were brilliant and capable, prepared them for a world that would try to tell them otherwise. She did for other people's children what Clara couldn't do for her. She mothered them, believed in them, fought for them." Elena listened to this exchange and grasped a profound truth. Clara Washington had lost both her children to a system designed to dismantle black families and deny black motherhood. But both children, raised in separate worlds, had dedicated their lives to fighting the very injustices their mother had endured. James in the legal system, Diane's grandmother in the classroom, both had channeled Clara's strength and love into work that changed lives. The revelation of the photograph's secret initiated a broader discussion about hidden black ancestry within white American families and the countless black mothers who had been separated from their children throughout American history. Historians began scrutinizing other family photographs from the era, searching for similar instances of black domestic workers positioned at the margins, wondering how many other Claras might be hidden in plain sight. Michael and Diane collaborated on a project to honor Clara's memory. They established the Clara Washington Foundation, dedicated to researching and documenting cases of forced family separation during the Jim Crow era, and supporting genealogical research for African Americans seeking to trace family members lost to adoption, migration, or racial violence. They also partnered with the Boston Historical Society to create a permanent exhibit about Clara, James, and the photograph. The exhibit featured the restored photograph, Clara's letters, James's confession, and contemporary reflections on how racial injustice had shaped American families. Elena contributed to the exhibit by creating a series of enhanced images, highlighting different aspects of the photograph. These included close-ups of Clara's face, the infant in her arms, and James standing with the Thornton family. Each image was accompanied by historical context about domestic servitude, anti-miscegenation practices, and the legal structures that enabled men like Richard Thornton to father children with black women while facing no repercussions. The exhibit also tackled a difficult question: how should Richard Thornton be remembered? He had fathered 2 children with Clara, a woman who worked in his household and possessed little power to resist his advances. Was this relationship consensual? Or had Clara been exploited by a man who held complete economic and social power over her? Clara's letters offered some clarity. In one passage she had written, "I do not claim to have been forced against my will, but neither can I claim I was free to refuse. What freedom does a servant have when her employer demands her company? What choice exists when refusal might mean unemployment, homelessness, starvation? I cared for him. I will not deny that. But care that exists within such an imbalance of power cannot be called love. Not truly." The exhibit acknowledged this complexity, portraying Richard Thornton neither as a simple villain nor as a progressive man ahead of his time. Instead, he was presented as someone who had participated in a system of racial and economic exploitation, even while occasionally demonstrating mercy, paying Clara's hospital bills, allowing her to keep James for 6 years, and perhaps even arranging for the photograph that preserved her motherhood. The photograph itself became an iconic image. It was featured in textbooks, used in classrooms to teach about hidden histories and the complexities of race in America. Copies were requested by museums across the country. Artists created works inspired by Clara's image, celebrating her dignity and mourning the children taken from her. But perhaps the most profound legacy came from the descendants themselves. Michael and Diane, united by the discovery of their shared ancestry, became close friends. They introduced their children and grandchildren to each other, forging family connections that had been severed for over a century. Michael's children and grandchildren, who had grown up identifying as white, now had to confront their black ancestry and what it meant for their identity. Some immediately embraced it, feeling it validated something they had always sensed about their family. Others struggled with the revelation, unsure how to reconcile their lived experience as white people with the knowledge of their black great-grandmother. Diane's family, who had always identified as black, welcomed the connection to Clara's white descendants they had never known existed. But complexity existed here too. There was pain in learning that Clara's son had lived his life as white, while their ancestor had endured the full weight of racial oppression. There were questions about what it meant that some of Clara's descendants had benefited from whiteness, while others had not. These conversations were challenging, but Michael and Diane insisted they were essential. "Clara's legacy is not just in the photograph," Michael said at one family gathering. "It's in us, all of us, facing the truth of our history, understanding how racism shaped our family, and choosing to move forward together." The publicity surrounding the photograph led to one final unexpected discovery. A genealogist in Connecticut named Thomas contacted Michael after seeing news coverage of the story. He had been researching his wife's family tree and had found that her grandmother, adopted from the Boston Home for Colored Children in 1901, might be connected to the Thornton case. Thomas sent documentation showing that his wife's grandmother, Sarah, had been adopted by a black family in New York at the exact time Clara's daughter had been placed for adoption. The adoptive family had only been told that the baby's mother was a domestic servant who could not keep her child and that the father was unknown. Michael immediately arranged to meet Thomas and his wife, Linda. When they met, Michael showed them the photograph of Clara holding the infant, and Linda began to weep. "My grandmother died when I was young," Linda said. "But my mother told me that grandmother Sarah always felt like something was missing from her life. She had been loved by her adoptive family, had a good childhood, but she always wondered about her birth mother. She kept that small photograph, the one of just Clara and the baby, on her dresser her entire life. My mother said grandmother would look at it and say, 'She loved me. I can see it in her eyes. She didn't want to give me away.'" DNA testing confirmed what the documents suggested. Linda was Clara Washington's great-granddaughter, descended from the daughter Clara had been forced to surrender in 1901. Linda, Diane, and Michael were all Clara's descendants, 3 branches of a family tree that had been deliberately severed, yet had somehow, against all odds, rediscovered each other. The 3 of them traveled to Boston together to visit Clara's grave. She was interred in a cemetery in Roxbury, in a section reserved for black Bostonians. Her headstone was simple, listing only her name and dates. Clara Washington, 1875–1935. Standing before Clara's grave, Michael, Diane, and Linda held hands. They told Clara that they had found each other, that her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were united again, and that her story would be remembered and honored. "You were hidden in the shadows of that photograph," Michael said softly to Clara's memory. "But you refused to be completely invisible. You insisted on being seen, on being acknowledged as a mother, even in the margins. And because of that photograph, because of your courage, we found each other. We found you." They commissioned a new headstone for Clara, one that listed not just her name, but her truth. Clara Washington, 1875–1935, beloved mother. Her strength lives on in her descendants. The dedication ceremony for the new headstone was attended by over 100 people, descendants of Clara, descendants of James, former students of Diane's grandmother, lawyers who had collaborated with James Thornton, and historians who had been inspired by the photograph's discovery. Elena spoke at the ceremony, explaining how she had found Clara concealed in the shadows of the family photograph, and how digital restoration had revealed what had been obscured for 123 years. Clara Washington was rendered invisible by a society that denied black women's humanity, that denied black mothers' rights to their own children, Elena said. But she found a way to make herself seen. She stood in that garden holding her baby and insisted on being photographed. That act of quiet resistance, that refusal to be completely erased, is what allowed her story to survive. Clara knew she might never be able to tell her truth openly, but she made sure there would be evidence, made sure that someday someone might look closely enough to see her. After the ceremony, Linda approached Eleanor with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for looking closely. Thank you for seeing my great-grandmother. Thank you for refusing to let her stay hidden." Eleanor embraced her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this discovery had meant to Clara's descendants. A photograph she had been hired merely to restore had unlocked an entire hidden history, reunited a family separated for over a century, and brought recognition to a woman whose motherhood had been denied and erased. 6 months after the dedication of Clara's headstone, Elena's work on the photograph was featured in a major museum exhibition titled Hidden Histories: Black Women in the Shadows of American Photography. The exhibition included the Thornton family photograph alongside dozens of other images where black women appeared at the margins, in the background, partially obscured or cropped out of the frame. The exhibition's central idea was powerful. These women had been deliberately rendered invisible by families and photographers who wanted to present a specific image of white respectability. However, their presence in the photographs, no matter how marginal, provided evidence of the labor, the relationships, and the hidden family connections that white families sought to deny. Elena's restoration of the Clara Washington photograph became the centerpiece of the exhibition. Visitors could view both the original faded image, where Clara was barely discernible in the shadows, and the restored, enhanced version, where her face and the infant in her arms were clearly visible. The contrast demonstrated how much had been concealed and how technology could help reveal suppressed truths. The exhibition traveled to museums across the country, and everywhere it went, people came forward with their own narratives. Families who had always suspected there was something concealed in their history, who had heard whispered tales about black ancestors who had been denied or erased, who had found mysterious photographs showing people at the margins whose identities had been lost. Michael, Diane, and Linda participated in panel discussions at several exhibition venues, discussing what it meant to discover Clara's story and how it had altered their understanding of their families and themselves. Michael spoke about the burden and privilege of passing, about his grandfather James's choice to live as white while fighting for black civil rights. Diane discussed her grandmother's life as a black woman who never knew she had a white passing brother working toward the same goals from a different position. Linda discussed the pain of adoption and separation, and the joy of finally knowing the truth about her great-grandmother's love. But the exhibition also drew criticism. Some argued that focusing on photographs of black domestic servants in white households perpetuated narratives of black subservience and white supremacy. Others questioned whether it was ethical to display images of women like Clara, who might not have wanted their exploitation documented and exhibited for public viewing. Elena took these criticisms seriously. In the exhibition catalog, she addressed them directly. "We must be careful not to reproduce the very erasure and exploitation we're trying to document," she wrote. Clara Washington deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, not just as someone who was wronged, but as a full human being, a woman who loved, who made difficult choices, who showed tremendous strength, and who found a way to ensure her motherhood would be documented even when it was denied. The photograph is evidence of injustice, yes, but it's also evidence of Clara's agency, her resistance, her refusal to be completely erased. The exhibition concluded with a section on contemporary implications, showing how the legacy of forced family separation, denied black motherhood, and hidden black ancestry continued to impact American families. It included stories of adoption, foster care, and child welfare systems that disproportionately separated black children from their families. It drew connections between Clara's experience in 1901 and ongoing patterns of systemic racism. For Elena, the project had evolved into much more than a photograph restoration job. It had become a mission to honor Clara and the countless women like her whose stories had been buried, whose motherhood had been denied, whose presence had been erased from family histories. She reflected on this in the final chapter of a book she wrote about the discovery. "When I first saw that shadow in the garden, I didn't know I was looking at Clara Washington," she wrote. "I didn't know I was about to uncover a story of love and loss, exploitation and resistance, separation and reunion. I simply saw something that didn't look quite right, something that seemed hidden. That's what historians do. We look at what's been overlooked. We question what's been accepted. We bring light to the shadows. Clara Washington spent her life in the shadows of the Thornton family's world. But she made sure she was in that photograph. She made sure that even if she was marginalized, even if she was nearly invisible, she was there. And 123 years later, she was finally seen. The book became required reading in many American history courses. The photograph was reproduced in textbooks. Clara's story became a part of the historical record, no longer hidden, no longer denied. Michael, Diane, and Linda continued their work with the Clara Washington Foundation, assisting other families in researching hidden histories and reconnecting with ancestors who had been lost to adoption, migration, or deliberate erasure. They provided funding for DNA testing for people searching for family connections, supported genealogical research, and advocated for the opening of sealed adoption records. On the 125th anniversary of the photograph in 2026, descendants of Clara Washington gathered at the site of the former Thornton Mansion in Boston. The building had been converted into a community center, and the garden where the photograph had been taken was now a public park. Over 50 people attended, descendants of both James and Sarah, now united as one family. They planted a tree in Clara's honor, installed a plaque telling her story, and shared memories of how her legacy had shaped their lives. Elena attended the gathering and was deeply moved by the sight of Clara's family, reunited across racial lines that had once seemed insurmountable, standing together in the very spot where Clara had stood holding her baby, insisting on being seen. Clara Washington's story is not just about the past, Eleanor said to the assembled group. It's about how we choose to remember, how we honor the people whose voices were silenced, whose presence was denied, whose love was hidden. By bringing Clara out of the shadows, by telling her truth, we're not just correcting a historical record. We're affirming that every mother matters, that every person deserves to be seen, that justice can come even 123 years late. As the sun set over the garden, Elena looked at the photograph one more time, the image that had begun this entire journey. Clara Washington stood in the shadows holding her infant daughter, her face now clearly visible to the world. She was no longer hidden. She was no longer erased. She was finally, fully, undeniably seen. And her legacy, in her descendants, in the foundation bearing her name, and in the countless people inspired by her story, would ensure she would never be forgotten.